they are just the most exciting thing you can read or write, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've been noticing a lot recently that loads on social media, a screenshot of the page on a particular edition of The Lord of the Rings where Gandalf confronts the Witch King of Angmar during the battle in Gondor. Seems to be going around a lot with just the comment, "This is the single greatest page of prose ever written." And yeah, that kind of talking, battles, those kind of epic fantasy battles are, we've done well, the greatest bits of prose it is ever written to read and to write, frankly. They are just, there is just something about reading, writing, or indeed watching a good fantasy or science fiction battle that is just, for me, that's just something else. I think it's probably what I do best, is what I enjoy writing best, certainly. And it's, I never get tired of it.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 174 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me this week is my co-host, my bestie from the Midwestie, the queen of my days, Greta Kelly. How you doing, Greta?
I'm good. Ready to fight some battles today.
Yeah, and if you want some awesome battles, go check out The Queen of Days by Greta Kelly or The Frozen Crown and Seventh Queen. Just battlefield. There are like different scales of battles, but it's a good time.
Yeah. There's some shit kicking in Queen of Days, and there's some battles in Frozen
and then some battles, yeah.
But speaking of shit kicking, go check out Mushroom Blues too to get your murder, mayhem, and mushroom fix for the day.
There actually is a battle in Mushroom Blues.
There is, yes.
There is, yeah. But not your typical battle. And also go check out Among Thieves, MJ's awesome debut novel, as well as the sequel, Thick as Thieves. If you want a complete duology full of more ass-kicking and more battles and heists and hatchets, all kinds of crazy shit, and go support MJ's cats because she's the best. As well, a quick note for listeners, you can support SFF Addicts on Patreon for a ton of cool extras like bonus episodes, author readings, and more. So check the links in the description to help us do what we do here. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now, joining us once again is the amazing Anna Smith Spark, author of the Empires of Dust series, A Woman of the Sword, and more, including her latest releases, A Sword of Gold and Ruin, and Anderson vs. Death. Welcome back to the show, Anna. How are you today?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. And yes, still in my parents' spare room, still with a hideous blind.
If you tuned in last week, the curtain is still there.
I don't know, it's growing on me. I don't know what the fuss is about.
It's clearly not the worst curtain in the world.
See, I always thought my parents had good taste, but the more I look at that curtain, it's just like, what?
Yeah.
And the bed that looks like a prison bed as well. I'm really sorry.
Sorry, we are not spending this masterclass shitting on Anna's parents. They're clearly good people. But if you want to know more about Anna and how she came to be the person that she is today, you can go check out part 1 to get to know her better. Go check out last week's episode. Today, though, quoting Lord of the Rings, "Spears shall be shaken and shields shall be splintered," as we talk about how to write battle scenes, which is a topic that I'm very, very excited that you suggested, Anna. Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor. What happens when an infernal warrior longs to be a noble paladin, or a thunder mage solves problems with lightning and nudity, or a vampire kangaroo joins your crew? You get The Malevolent Eight, Sebastien de Castell's riotous dark fantasy sequel to The Malevolent Seven, where a gang of foul-mouthed wizards somehow end up saving the world. Kind of. It's got blood spells gone wrong, rat mages, infernal contracts, and enough chaos to torch the multiverse. All delivered with Sebastian's signature flair. Magic, mayhem, moral bankruptcy. Just another day with the Malevolent Eight. Read it today before it burns everything down, including your bookshelf. The Malevolent Eight, now available in hardcover, wherever good and evil books are sold. And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts. And just to kick off this discussion, I want to ask you what appeals to you about battle scenes in fiction, and kind of like what are they able to add to a story?
They are just the most exciting thing you can read or write, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've been noticing a lot recently that loads on social media, a screenshot of the page on a particular edition of The Lord of the Rings where Gandalf confronts the Witch King of Angmar during the battle in Gondor. Seems to be going around a lot with just the comment, "This is the single greatest page of prose ever written." And yeah, battles, those kind of epic fantasy battles are, we've done well, the greatest bits of prose it is ever written to read and to write, frankly. They are just, there is just something about reading, writing, or indeed watching a good fantasy or science fiction battle that is just, for me, that's just something else. I think it's probably what I do best, is what I enjoy writing best, certainly. And it's, I never get tired of it, to be honest with you. I can't.
Neither do we.
So how do you think battle scenes in fiction can reflect our own history and the battles that have sort of influenced the trajectory of humanity as a whole?
So I actually use, all my battles are based on real battles. So the battles in Empires of Dust are all based on battles that Alexander the Great fought. So I love military history. I read an awful lot of military history. Actually, probably a very personal reason why I really enjoy reading and writing battle scenes is, I think, actually, and this makes me sound completely insane, although we probably established that last episode.
Say it.
Pretty serious. As people know, as I said last episode, and for those who didn't know already, so I'm multiply neuroatypical. I'm dyslexic, dyspraxic, and autistic. And I suspect that bound up with that, I have synesthesia, and the synesthesia is triggered by medieval military terminology and classical military terminology and military language around sort of military historical accounts. I also have a even more disturbing feeling that I can never remember the name, but people watch those sensory videos of the sound of having your hair brushed.
Mm-hmm.
What's it called? ASMR?
ASMR, yep.
Yes. I think that is also triggered in me by reading military accounts of military history.
That is like the most specific form of ASMR imaginable. Yeah. Just go to a blacksmith and just listen to them like sharpening blades.
I think it's like a literary version of people who can only relax at night if they're watching like police procedurals or true crime documentaries.
Yeah, true. This is how I unwind, is like watching Jeffrey Dahmer.
It's something about the language of they're kind of, Alexander lines up his troops with his horse on his left flank and then you get and then Darius was going to try and roll him up from his right flank and there were skirmishes and something about that language. It does actually, it triggers sensory taste experiences in me. It does trigger some kind of synesthetic reaction. I also do feel it as a SMR reaction somehow. So, and I realised this quite recently because it is basically my comfort read. So when I'm tired or when I'm feeling particularly stressed, I will read military history. And also, my BA was in classical studies, so I read an awful lot of classical military history. That's the really bizarre thing about when you start learning Greek and Latin. The first things you learn are things like our language around our military is military language, because so much of Greek and Latin texts are concerned with war and military language. So the verb you decline for Latin is bello, which is to fight. So that's you decline and to fight and battle. So so all the battles in Empires of Dust are based on real battles. So I would take a sort of a historian's reconstruction of the battle schematics of Issus or Gaugamela or the High Battle of Hydaspes, and look at the kind of map. Those were wonderful little maps, or the little squares. So the kind of like, these are Alexander's horse, and these are his foot, and then a little arrow which shows that somehow, and then somehow there's little diagrams which somehow, but no one understands those diagrams. Seriously, I do not believe a single military historian actually these diagrams. But in some strange way, they supposedly show you how Alexander won this battle. And I would read accounts of them, and then I'd write them up in a fictional style and putting myself in the mind of different characters. And I think those kind of use that sort of sense of doing some research into military history to get a sense of what's possible and what actually happened, and why people think it's likely that one side or the other won or one side lost. It gives you that kind of grounding in what's plausible. And I don't mean writing those. I struggle with writing those very technical, or indeed re-understanding those very kind of technical battle accounts, which are very much about kind of different stored strokes and kind of different poses people are in. I mean, Christian / Miles Cameron does this very, very well. I can never visualize what his characters are doing. He writes it very beautifully, and you have but he obviously understands what he's doing, and he has this absolute, there's absolute conviction that he has clearly that what he's describing works. And I guess I'd do the same thing, but in terms of kind of cavalry maneuvers, or kind of the way the infantry are responding to the cavalry maneuver. But it's having that confidence that this thing I'm describing worked because it did work, or that kind of it conceivably works because and having that confidence, because it is, a lot of people sort of really worry about writing fighting scenes and battle scenes. And certainly, actually, I did before I wrote, when I started writing Empires of Dust, I was building up to the kind of big people on people battle. I mean, I've never been in a fight. I've never been in a fight. I'm physically pretty mal-coordinated. I could not imagine what it would be like to be in a fight. And so I was really like, how am I, I don't know how I'm going to write this. How am I going to carry this off with any conviction when this is something that is so far out of my comfort zone? And obviously, I guess writing something like people fighting a dragon is one thing. So you're like, okay, this is, no one is going to be able to say
You're not going to get anyone coming at you on Twitter
this
saying,
is not historically accurate.
Yes. I mean, yeah, actually there always is someone, but yeah, that kind of, but when you're writing people on people, there is that sense of, I cannot begin to understand how this feels. I mean, I don't know, Adrian, you may have been in many fist fights, knife fights, gunfights.
Of course I have, clearly. I'm covered in tattoos. Of course I've been in fights.
But that kind of general sense. And then actually often you do often get someone on a panel. I've done a lot of panels on writing fighting, and you get someone who says things like, oh, well, I've got a kind of I've got a black belt in judo, or kind of, I do a lot of reenactment or something. And I'm like, I'm not any of those. I do some aerobics videos. I guess I know how it feels to be kind of feeling a bit hot and tired out.
But that's the thing. It's like the confidence that you display on the page is kind of like the confidence that you've accrued through, on one hand, reading historical accounts of battles and military strategy and that kind of thing, but also just like when it comes to fiction, these are like the battles that I've read in countless books. And it's like reading the Battle of Helm's Deep in The Lord of the Rings, and you're like, oh my God, and like the way it's portrayed on the page, all of these reading experiences kind of inform how you yourself want to convey a battle. Christian Cameron might decide, I have all this experience with sword fighting, with reenactment, et cetera, and therefore he's able to apply his own personal experience to that kind of battle. But for people who haven't been in a fight or in a battle or something like that, or haven't done reenactment or don't know much about swords, it can be kind of like a different style of representing battle, one that is more focused on the broad strokes of the action, the emotion, and those kinds of things. But
Yeah,
are
yes.
there specific battles that you can think of in like books or TV shows or movies or anything that like spring to mind for you that is like, I really loved the way that this was portrayed and it kind of informed how I approach writing battles?
I mean, I guess the classic one for me is actually the Battle of Helm's Deep. The way it's portrayed in the films. I probably do, that I probably do think about that battle every couple of days.
Is it your
It's your
Roman
Roman
Empire?
Empire.
Yeah.
I could probably watch.
That should be a t-shirt. Helm's Deep
Yeah.
is my Roman Empire.
Yo, let's fucking make some merch.
I could probably watch that scene possibly every day for a very long time without getting bored. And I have studied, and I think again, like reading military fiction, military history, sorry, to get a sense of what's possible. I have really studied that scene to try and look at what makes it effective. I have really kind of looked at it in real detail. I've watched it again and again and again to really try and think about what are the unpack what are the elements of that scene that really affect me and that that really make it for me as a really important battle. I mean, just little things like there's that I really, really love just little bits like when we've got the build up and there's that sort of sight, the picture, they're all on the wall in silence. And then that window, the shutter bangs. And that just little moments like that I've just, I've watched it and taken it apart to think about what's going on there. What are they doing there? And I've done that. I do that almost every time I'm watching battle scenes. And I will almost, if I've got a battle scene coming up, I will almost go and watch quite a few, sort of several good battles to kind of get like what is going on here, what are they doing here, and try and it is always cinematic. I don't read other people's battle scenes and think what's going on here. Actually, possibly apart from R. Scott Baker, who is just so far. I mean, his battles are just so far above anyone else's. I just look at them with awe. But otherwise, the battle scenes that really, really get to me are visual, watching films, and then trying to work out and then trying to kind of use language to bring in all those different elements in cinema. So I think that's really important in the sense of the kind of the total kind of multi-sensory experience of war and of combat, that kind of this isn't just about what's happening to people. This is about, what the entire sensory experience. It's a lot of it is about the emotional experience, and that's been conveyed through all the different senses. So that kind of looking at what's going in, almost that kind of, what's the camera angle here?
Yeah, it's kind of like being like a director for this battle scene, and even if you're portraying it on the page, it's kind of like, approaching it like narrative cinematography, and thinking about like the ways in which the scene flows, the ways in which certain things are certain focal points and things like that is really important and really cool.
Yeah, I think it is, when you're right, it is because it is not something that most of us have any real experience of. Getting that, thinking about how is this staged? How am I going to stage this? What's going on from all the different perspectives, I think is really, really valuable and interesting to kind of, watching battles, watching visually, seeing battles represented, and then thinking about how you translate that into words. That's certainly for me, that's kind of a really huge kind of thing in terms of my writing, in terms of kind of setting it out. Because obviously, so you go from the kind of the schematics of the real battles, which give me a sense of kind of, well, this did work. I have a confidence that I'm writing, knowing that it seems plausible that this charge is going to do what I want it to do, because it did. So having that confidence that kind of I believe in what I'm writing, and you can often tell, you can often tell, you can tell very often in books that point where the author thinks like, oh, I'm slightly worried someone isn't going to be convinced by this. At
It's
that
like,
point, everything
I'm
breaks down.
fucking winging this. And
Yes, we are on this journey together.
I am flailing.
Yes, and you can really see
Yeah,
that. And then
yeah.
combining that sense of, okay, I'm going to write, I kind of feel a confidence in the structure of this. I feel a confidence in the structure of this battle because an actual battle was apparently structured a bit like this and ended up the way I wanted to end. And then that visual sense of, and I'm going to think about all the different ways it looked and all the different ways and frankly, I'm going to, rip it off. I think I actually often say to people in the beginning writing a battle scene, well, just literally just write the Battle of Helm's Deep, except you're one of the people in the back line, and then it goes wrong and you lose, and then obviously don't then change the names later and maybe I'll shrink it.
But it's like a writing exercise.
Go from there, because you know where it's going, so you can concentrate on the immersing the reader, yourself and the characters and therefore the reader in what's happening, rather than sort of thinking like, oh, and what's going to happen next? How is this battle going to be won?
Yeah.
But
that's a good point about context and having those context cues for your reader, because obviously as exciting as a good battle scene can be, there still has to be a reason for it. Like it just can't come out of nowhere. So how do you as an author go about laying the seeds for that grander conflict in your story, before the battle even begins?
Well, my books are very kind of military, very much sort of military. So it's all about the build-up. So, it's kind of sort of fairly kind of, there are a lot of big set-piece battles. So but what's kind of, and I am actually also a great believer in that, that famous adage, if people's attention seems to be flagging, just bring in a man with a gun. That kind of, if you're beginning to think, oh, this is just trailing off a bit, then essentially
bringing in some siege weapons.
Yes, throwing in a bit of violence. There's not a huge set-piece battle, but throwing in a bit of violence can tend to is a great way of shaking things up a bit and just kind of getting your plot moving again and getting your characters moving again. So it can be a nice thing. It can just be a good thing to throw in occasionally as a kind of, if you've had a lot of sort of conversations and things, just throwing in a bit of random violence can sort of just shake things up a bit. And I think it does there is a lot of truth in that sort of that old saying. It does keep people going. And I don't think there's, people often kind of say, well, but that's kind of gratuitous. Like, well, yes. It's all gratuitous, isn't it? It's kind of, we don't need to describe these things. We could just skirt over it. A lot of historical fiction skirts over battles. In fact, particularly historical fiction. There's a great tradition of historical fiction written by women, which don't really talk about the battles at all, and they always skirt over it. So Philippa Gregory has written a whole series of books about the Wars of the Roses, and she doesn't really talk about the battles at all because that's not something she's interested in. And I guess, and people will sort of say, well, people who spend a lot of time writing the battles, that's extremely gratuitous. Well, yes, it is. Obviously, it is. I don't need to write any of these. So don't be afraid of that. Don't feel kind of that you just, don't feel, just go for it. Just kind of put in the fights and the battles and just sort of go for it and enjoy it. And I guess I kind of see most of what's going on around the battles in a lot of my writing is the other way around to your question, I guess, kind of secondary to the battles rather than how do we slot the battle in. It's kind of the rest of it is the kind of stuff around it. But that's because what's when I enjoy writing. So yeah.
But what can the battle itself then say? There is the reasons that this battle is happening, but what can that show readers about the world in which the book is set, the factions at play, and sort of like the relationships between different parts of this world and what is causing that conflict to arise?
Gosh, that's quite interesting because that sort of leads to questions about things like, there have been very different attitudes to things like how you fight and casualty figures throughout history. There's really interesting different periods. So the ancient Greeks and probably the kind of Celtic peoples in Europe seem to have had this actually very ritualized battle where you had almost continuous warfare between different communities, and all men were trained in war. But actually, casualty figures were very low, because historians do use this term ritualized warfare, where actually kind of the point is not to kill everybody. So you do get these bizarre bits in Greek historians where you sort of say they took very heavy casualties of 6 people. And of course, that is because if you're living in a kind of subsistence economy, if you're a fairly small community, even leaving 6 of your young men of kind of working age is going to really decimate your community. So they actually have this, you don't take casualties. So there is some idea that kind of classical warfare, that kind of the hoplite lines pushing together, and I write about a lot of them kind of pushing. It's almost like a rugby scrum. It's not about killing people. It's about pushing the other side back and occupying and kind of being, once you've broken them and they run away, if you can break their scrum and they flee, then you have won. And it's not about bloodshed. And then there's a kind of really interesting period during the Italian Renaissance when all warfare, there is a meaning point to all of this, which I'll come to, but there is when all warfare is essentially contracted out to mercenaries, condottieri, and they don't want to lose any people at all because they're hired professionals. They do not want to lose. They're being paid because they've got these men fighting for them. So they don't want to lose their men because then they won't be able to be a powerful condottieri anymore. So they have this really bizarre form of warfare where you don't do anything to avoid actually having a battle. And everybody knows this and agrees this. So you kind of maneuver around each other, the 2 armies, until one has managed to maneuver to the point where it's in a much better position than the other, at which point the other just gives up and the first one wins. So it's actually a kind of, there's no fighting. And then
it's more like an aggressive argument.
Yes, or a game of chess. It is almost like you're playing chess with your men, and if you can get your men to the point where they would clearly be in the massive advantage, and they would clearly be able to defeat the other lot because they've got the high ground or whatever, then you don't actually need to have the battle. You can just agree, kind of like, damn it, you've completely outflanked me, so we'll just agree that we won and that you won. And
that's a very civil
West Side Story.
Yeah.
Yes. And then, of course,
very
civil.
I appreciate that.
Like some of the later Roman imperial warfare, and particularly, of course, obviously modern warfare. First World War, you have casualties in the tens of thousands on one day. You have this concept of, and Second World War on the Eastern Front, you have the Germans and the Russians both throwing in troops into the meat grinder. And of course, we can see that that's what the Russians are doing now in Ukraine. It's not about anyone surviving. It's just about throwing so many people into the battle that essentially the other side run out of bullets because you've overwhelmed them. And it doesn't matter that almost every one of your people has been shot.
And this fits into the concept, which is definitely a more modern concept of total war.
Yes. But you'd also, the Romans had a sort of similar, the Romans would carry out total war, and there have been periods in the ancient world. But those kind of these different, and then of course you have the Vikings, who really actually, people always have this image of the Vikings as incredibly bloodthirsty, but they really go out of their way to actually, to avoid fighting other armed men. What they really want to do is turn up at somewhere like a nunnery, where the chances of anyone fighting back are very low, commit terrible, run into their swords, kill totally unarmed people, ideally only women and children, and then leg it back to the ship before anyone turns up with a weapon. And they will go out of their way to avoid battles. So that kind of up against anyone who actually might look like they're in any way capable of fighting back. So, and those different attitudes to what war means and what fighting means in different cultures are something it's really, really interesting to think about when you're thinking about writing your world. So that kind of, what actually is are your people and their enemies' attitude to things like taking casualties, to things like taking risk, that kind of classic trope that we often have about the small band who are going to hold the door or hold the bridge, and we all know they are all going to die. And that kind of that kind of wonderful heroic moment where someone kind of says, tell her I loved her and I would have come home, but I am going to, I'm going to die so that you will all live. And in some cultures, in Roman culture, that would have been absolutely celebrated. So you get a lot of stories of, the Camillus who holds the bridge, and those stories of this kind of heroic figure. In other cultures, that just isn't conceivable because you don't fight in that way. Or that kind of, the sort of notion, the huge army just being sent in against, sent up to the huge wall to batter themselves to death against the walls. And, that's a trope of someone saying to the warlord, but they'll all die. And the warlord saying, yes, but that doesn't matter. In some cultures, that is entirely conceivable. In some cultures, it just isn't. And it's kind of interesting thinking about those different perspectives and what happens perhaps when different armies with different attitudes to taking casualties or to what war means come up against each other. And that kind of shock of sort of either kind of, but they're not retreating, or but they are retreating. So, I mean, the Spartans are kind of brilliant. There's sort of ancient Sparta, there was this famous thing. Women were supposedly said to their husbands, come back with your shield or on it. In other words, come back victorious or die, don't bother coming back. And there's this story that the Spartans would not surrender, which is clearly shown to be untrue endless times. But the idea was you did not surrender, you fought to the last man, and that's what Thermopylae is about. And other cultures just wouldn't get that, where, obviously you surrender. How stupid are you? Apart from anything else, if you keep doing that, there won't be any of us left. And then kind of...
It doesn't make for as good of a story.
Exactly. But it does play into like different cultures' perceptions of like what honor means, the value of a life, that kind of thing. There's like so many different fascinating cultural nuances that you can portray through exactly what you said, the lens through which this culture views war and enacts war and carries out campaigns and battles and like all different kinds of levels of it is really really
it's
fascinating.
really, really interesting. I mean, you get some really interesting historical moments where kind of there's a really horrible accounts of Alexander in India where he's fought the Persians, and the Greeks have been fighting for a long time. So they are familiar with the way that they have a shared concept of warfare. And then he gets to India and he's fighting people who are clearly kind of the ancestors of their religion is the ancestor of modern Hinduism. And they have a very, very strong sense of things like caste and sense of what's clean and unclean. And they will fight to the last. And then, there are stories of the entire community self-immolates when they see the Macedonians are winning, because they would rather die than let the Macedonians conquer their city. And as far as the Macedonians are concerned, this is just this is just inconceivable. This isn't even, but what you're doing is insane. It's just what you're doing is just beyond human imagination, because that's not how classical warfare worked in the slightest. And it's really quite horrifying reading these accounts of the Macedonians trying to articulate what's going on here, because they're used to sacking a city and they're used to committing atrocities. But the idea that everyone is, literally entire communities are burning themselves to death, and that really kind of interesting negotiation of different attitudes to violence and to war, and how those kind of, or very, very different, again, also kind of very different senses of what an army might be or how you fight. So again, the kind of classic, again, is the classical period is the kind of difference between the kind of massed ranks of soldiers, and then you have the Scythians, who are horse nomads, who they ride off, they have their skirmishers, and these kind of big classic armies don't know how to cope with this, because they're expecting the other side to line up and for them to kind of charge each other.
I mean, it's like so many of the different cultures that were confronted by the Mongolian horde, who were just like,
Yes.
I have no idea how the fuck to
defeat this.
To defeat
what
like what is going on here? You know, it's like, it's kind of like and it also happened with, just a specific example is like the United States Army and the French Army in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, or everything that led up to the Vietnam War as well. And it's kind of like guerrilla warfare in the ways in which people are able to use their location and their familiarity with their surroundings to basically like outmaneuver, even if they are the underdog in this particular scenario, outmaneuver the opposing army. And it's really fascinating the way that like setting can play into a battle. And you know, I mean, Greta put in the question, like a really funny line of like, much like in real estate, battles are all about location. And this goes back to something like Thermopylae. The Greeks, the Spartans were able to utilize the hot gates to funnel the opposing Persian army into a smaller, tighter space that they were able to better control, right? So how do you approach choosing a setting for your battle scene?
I think that setting up setting is really important because of that, because you're building the tension. So again, if we go back to the Battle of Helm's Deep, you have that immediate tension there. On the one hand, we're in a fortress which is going to be very difficult to take. So on the one hand, obviously, we've got the kind of, how are the orcs going to do this? And you do have that lovely setup with the kind of Saruman with his sort of giving you the sort of teaser that he's going to use gunpowder. But that kind of, how are the orcs going to possibly not just going to fail to take this thing? But on the other hand, you then also have that immediate tension of, well, of course, the moment the wall is breached, everyone's trapped inside, and that setup is what's crucial. So, and that, or again, also other battles where you have, even with the same films, then you have kind of shortly before that, you've had the battle between the sort of the Rohirrim, particularly with their kind of their baggage train, and then you've got the orcs and the wargs. So you have that space. You have a very different kind of battle. You have a running battle. You have space. You have people kind of appear. You have the ability of different small groups to appear from all kinds of odd angles. You've got that sense of, what if they're going to come from behind me? I physically cannot have my back to the wall. They could come from any side. They're looking for Aragorn, and he could have gone anywhere. They're being spread out. They're kind of almost trapped by space. And that kind of really different, and of course it's partly there, if you think about it, it is there as a kind of counterpoint, because you've got this big space and this sort of sense of running. And then you've got this sense of claustrophobia, and they're all contained. And that balancing those two battles is actually kind of really, it gives the effectiveness. I think it gives more effectiveness to Helm's Deep. You've had that different sense of battle, but it's a very different way of, if you think about the way they're filmed very differently. You get that very, very active camera work with the attack by the wargs. And again, using those different settings, trying to use language and description which conveys a different sense of settings, there's different sense of how you feel. Think about being kind of on the, you're back to the wall, you're pretty confident they're not going to get in, but if they do get in, you're back to the wall, there's nowhere you can go, versus they've suddenly come from nowhere. They could come from anywhere. You're sort of turning and turning constantly. Everything's an absolute confusion, yet they're all coming from different directions. You can use things like arrows coming from all different directions, and all of those kind of the different speed of the two battles is really kind of having those different tonalities, different sense of tonalities, and using landscape to create those different approaches and to have those different senses, and using obviously as soon as you've got the landscape set up, the battle should follow and fit within that.
Right. Like it's like Helm's Deep is the setting informs the fact that it becomes a siege battle. Yeah. Right. Or the battle with the wargs informs the fact that it's kind of like more of a sort of like a civilian versus
more like not quite guerrilla, but
it's kind of like more of like a Mongolian style, like hit and run, a skirmish type thing.
And thinking about those kind of thinking about using those different kind of perspectives. And I mean, it's also what's interesting, again, thinking about the Lord of the Rings, is the way that they they did at the back. You think about the ending, the Battle of the Black Gate. They get rid of the horses. If you think about it, there is absolutely no, unless we're led to believe that every single member of the Rohirrim's horse has died, and no one has any, there are just no horses left. So we have all these people. We have the mounted knights of Gondor. We have some mounted knights in Gondor. We see people with horses in Gondor. We have all the Rohirrim turning up on their horses. And then if you think about it, when we march out to the Black Gate, everyone is on foot.
That is a very good point, and that's
And
very
you suddenly think about
ridiculous.
they've done that because otherwise we'd have another battle on horses, and we've already done the battle on horses.
I mean, like from like a military strategic point of view, keep your fucking horses.
Yes,
right.
But from like a cinematic narrative standpoint, you want to create that variety in the types of battles that you're portraying.
You've had the kind of you've done the big horse charge.
Yep.
And you've had the kind of wonderfully mobile horses crashing into people. And you've had the massive battle. When you've got to the Battle of the Black Gate, you've got a much more condensed. You end up with that very compact. Everyone is compacted.
Yeah, that last stand kind of vibe.
Yeah, then you have the last stand. And that you could not do that with horses. Now, that is an absolutely amazing film, and here we are saying, actually, that's really stupid. I mean, how is Aragorn that they go, the Rohirrim, their whole lives are based on horses. And,
Gondor is fucked under his leadership.
But, at the time, you kind of write that, and obviously, it is highly likely that at some point later on, a reader is going to be like, hang on, why did your genius military tactician dump all the horses? That was just, he's a horse lord. Why does he dump all these horses and go on foot? She's only done that so she can have the battle where they end up making the last stand all packed together. But of course, at the time, your reader is just like, oh my God, they're doing we've had the big horse battle, and that's exciting. And now we've got everyone packed together having the last stand and battle. And it's only later they're going to wait, hang on, clearly she just did the same horse battle again. But it's having, doing that, thinking about how I'm going to use different landscapes, how I'm going to use slightly different styles of battle. If you do the same battle over and over and over again, it's going to get really tedious.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad you mentioned your brilliant military tactician, because
Aragorn's lack of
many
planning,
times,
dude.
We read stories where the main character knows that the battle is going to happen, and they have their council meeting and they go over who's going to do what and where. And not a lot of times, but sometimes these meetings can get kind of boring for a reader to actually read. So how do you, as an author, balance needing your readers to understand the broad strokes of what's about to happen or what is happening in this battle without bogging them down with so many details that they're no longer able to really understand what is happening?
So I think what you can really use war councils for, actually showing up different characters, because they're not people having a really long argument about, well, should we place, should we put the horse there or should we maybe put them here, or kind of, that is, you're right, incredibly boring. And it kind of is irrelevant, because the battle, if you write, if you have them planning out the battle and you describe the battle coming out in that way, one, that's really boring because you've just described the battle twice, just once in note form and once in detail. Also, it's not practically possible that it's going to work like that. But if you have a war council where people have different, the characters of the guy who wants the very defensive battle versus the kind of the hot young thing that just wants to go charge out there. All those those different perspectives and what that means, that obviously, you can obviously see those two individuals, different characters, just from that very brief description. And of course, it doesn't have to be. Very often you have the kind of older, wiser council kind of saying be defensive, and the kind of the young hotshot wanting to charge. But you can maybe kind of play with some of that. But the different perspectives and people's different senses on, are we going to win? Are we maybe going to lose? I really, 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 really don't want to die. Kind of, there's different voices that come out. And then, of course, you have the battle, which doesn't work out the way people thought it was going to work out. That's where the interest lies. The kind of, you can have the horrible pathos of people confidently talking about, we'll do this, and obviously we will overwhelm them because we have our sheer force of greater numbers, blah, 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 blah. And in that moment, that is a horrible act of hubris. And you know from that moment, okay, these guys are clearly going to lose.
Yeah, it's like in that scene in Monasterith, where I can't remember the name. Denethor sends
his son.
Faramir out to
Yes.
his death,
Yeah.
basically just like, you're following my command,
Yes.
and it's his hubris. It's the father's hubris that is
Yes.
essentially sending out his son to die.
Yeah, and that kind of that kind of, yeah, and that's what's setting it up. It's not, that's the interest. It's not the kind of the long, people get quite drawn into writing those long arguments about kind of the battle techniques, because it is quite fun to watch, in sort of Games and Thrones and things, when you're watching those kind of military councils, but they're actually quite short, plus also they can have other stuff going on in the background because it's visual. And kind of, they do that classic thing where you often have that dialogue, which also mysteriously involves extremely attractive slave servant women who, for some reason, don't have any clothes on at the same time. And that kind of does add a certain element to those conversations that you can't really have on the page. But kind of, it is, if you think about it, even when you're watching those, it's often people's faces and that kind of sense of the pathos of, okay, she's clearly for it because she's clearly not going to come back because she's so certain she is going to come back. Obviously, she's going to die, but it's not in a spoilery way. It's just in a kind of, it's in a kind of, that sort of mixture of horror and almost amusement. So it's using those passages to set up counsel and things. To set up kind of those counsel passages to set up kind of, character and,
like foreshadowing.
yeah, foreshadowing. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
because I think like once you actually get into the battle, you mentioned perspective, and I think there are two really important aspects of battle scenes, which is on one hand scale, the ways in like the your decisions about how you choose to portray the battle scene, whether it's like up close and personal, or if it's kind of showing like a broader scale of the conflict, but then the perspective of the actual like POV characters and how the emotions that you foreshadow in a scene like that, like pre-battle stuff, and then how that plays out when they actually they're like in the mire and they're just like living it and feeling like the visceral nature of being in that battle. How do you kind of balance that? How do you choose how you want to represent the scale, and then how characters experience the battle through that sense of scale?
So the scale is, I guess for me, it's more what era I'm writing, if that makes any sense. So Empires of Dust, we get bigger and bigger battles because I'm writing on a kind of an Alexander scale where we have really big, this is an entire continent, so we need an army capable. So I guess but then again, you need that variety of scale. So I like doing really big battles, but then I like trying to have reasons why we're having a smaller battle, because again, it gets boring to have the same size of army. So having those kind of smaller battles, because they do mean you have to write them in slightly different ways. So I sort of try and choose to have a mixture of both. But again, also, what the size of an army is an incredibly relative thing. So when you read, when you read sort of Viking and Anglo-Saxon accounts, their idea of a really massive army is very, very different to kind of the United States, modern United States idea of a massive army, because it's kind of totally different scales. So people, the Great Heathen Army was probably numbering in the tens of thousands. People talk about, a huge Viking army appeared, and when you actually drill down into it, they basically mean 500 combatants, and that's huge. So that kind of, if you're writing it, so it depends what scale you're talking about, and of course, if you're writing about a small number of villages, 500 extremely angry determined armed men is absolutely massive. Whereas if you're talking about a decent fortified city or a kind of band of particularly kind of tough wandering paladins, 500 men is nothing. So it's that kind of it's the other. I suppose it's the perspectives of both sides in terms of it's a big battle or a small battle. But really big battles, there is obviously massive issues around how you possibly narrate what's going on. I love describing really big battles, but so smaller battles, of course, you can get more sense of everyone's immediate perspective. Though then you do often run into that kind of problem of that kind of weird, why are half the people standing around doing nothing? And the famous joke about the kind of, if you're a massive gang of martial artists attack all time to attack one person, you don't attack him at once. You
don't
stand
take
around
turns.
kind of weird. You do someone weird dance and
like a dance battle.
It kind of does.
Just shimmy back and forth until Bruce Lee's ready for you. He's not ready yet.
Small battles when you're sort of like, hang on, why are there 3 people apparently on the edge of the battle just sort of standing there?
Or those moments in movies where it's just like someone dies and it's just like, oh, like my best friend died and I have to go up to him and like talk to him in his last dying moments. And clearly during that moment, no one else would be like, yo, I'm going to take a fucking axe to your back, bro.
To politely fight one-on-one.
Yeah.
We're going to have some kind of...
It's like, I'll give you...
We called time out, guys.
Yeah. I'm going to give you like a moment of solace so you can deal with this really, really devastating emotional moment.
And then I'm going to stab you.
Yeah. And then you're mine.
Whereas actually in a really, really big battle, you do get weird moments like that because things are just on such a huge scale that actually you can be in individual isolation. But I think I'm really wandering away from the original question, which was, so what I tend to do is, I like going in and out. So I like writing the description of what's happening on to the battle on a whole. I like kind of panning out to the big shot of everything and describing things in a kind of bird's eye view. And again, because I've read a lot of military history, I'm quite used to that, writing on that sort of scale. And I think actually, not to sound like I'm completely congratulating myself for being able to do it, but I think it is very hard. I think it is harder to keep the interest up because it can very easily get into a kind of very dry military history kind of accounts. But that chaos of the really, really big battle, where actually and on that sort of scale, no one really knows what's going on. So you can have someone seeing from a distance, and kind of who won't be involved, but who's watching from a distance. But they won't have a really clear sense of what's going on. But they have a sense of the battle ebbing and shifting. But they will have no sense of what's happening individually. Simply almost be kind of seeing these two sort of masses shifting together. Or
could be like a commander up on a hill, like watching down upon this battle.
Yes.
And I think this is kind of where like multi POV actually is such a benefit for battles. You can get the commander up on the field, but you can also get the person who's in the chaos.
And this is obviously much more of a problem if you're writing in first person or if you're writing in one person's close third. Because so Empires of Dust, I write in multi-person point of view, and I almost kind of take the back. So usually the chapters are an individual point of view chapter, but the battles, that sense of the chaos of we're head hopping, and Joe Abercrombie head hops a lot as well. That kind of sense of it's part of the chaos. Like suddenly we're being thrown from the commander on the hill who can see the overall totality of the battle, but they can't see the individual experiences. And we're suddenly thrown from that to the foot soldier's experience. And we're suddenly thrown from that to a cavalry officer's experience. And we're suddenly thrown from that. What's often very interesting is the people at the back, the medics or the servants or the non-combatants, kind of their experience is, but we can move around between all those different perspectives. And of course, we can also often move from, in a big multi-point of view fantasy, we can move from one side's perspective to the other, which is really enjoyable. When people do it well, that you get both sides' perspectives, and actually almost you kind of, it's more difficult if you're writing the kind of classic fantasy where we're clearly on
there's
one
clearly
side.
a good side and a bad side.
Yeah. It's like a human or an elf or a dwarf fighting an orc.
Yes, that's clearly much more difficult. But when you've got a kind of more, I guess often Grimdark does this, when you have a more kind of objective, but kind of, and even kind of, this happens quite a lot in Malazan, you suddenly switch to the other side's point of view for a little while. You get those kind of different perspectives. And that is really interesting, that you're not just getting the victor's perspective, you're seeing all the different sides, and that kind of, again, the ebb and flow of it and how it shifts, and that sense of like, we're winning, oh my God, we're losing on both sides, and that kind of, or that kind of the desperation of the few, and then the kind of dogged determination of the many who are overwhelming them, all those kind of different perspectives. And of course, it is a lot harder to get that interest if you're writing in first person or if you're writing in third, but in only from one point of view. And so that's something I've slightly cheated on a bit in my new series, which is told from, so A Sword of Bronze and Ashes and A Sword of Golden Ruin are told from the single point of view of that heroine, Canda. But I guess I slightly cheat because she has memories of stories of battles. And because she's remembering them as a story rather than her perspective, she can effectively tell them from multiple points of view, which is really cheating.
We'll allow it.
Finding some way, a first-person account of a battle can be absolutely amazing. And actually often catching that sense of the individual probably doesn't really know what's going on, but they're just in the thick of it, having that close first-person perspective of a battle. But what's often quite useful is having some kind of, finding some way of giving slightly different perspectives, possibly them talking to friends afterwards, or someone, the campaign historian, the campaign poet, someone giving some kind of slightly alternative, or, they happen to overhear the battle plans or something. Some way of giving you slightly different perspectives on things is kind of, this is not very helpful. Sorry, people who write.
No, it's very helpful.
It's really helpful.
It's kind of like perspective as a way of like controlling like the potential chaos of a
having that awareness of. I think probably writing really, really big battles is easier in some ways from a multiple. If you're doing when you write from a multi-point of view perspective, I suspect it's possibly one of the reasons why epic fantasy works so well with those really big. We kind of that's why that one of the things we enjoy about them that's different from those kind of very closely written books is because we can get all those different perspectives, and it's the classic way of doing it. But kind of, and then you get people like the kind of omniscient people who kind of do pull back into that omnipotent narrator. So you do get people who just sort of pull back a bit. You can get that sort of the bird's eye description, which R. Scott Baker does. So most of he moves between having he has multiple points of view, but he moves between having quite close third person points of view, and then he will pull back in his battles. So he will actually go back almost to give you a quite schematic kind of. So we'll talk about, kind of the left flank had to pull back, having taken atrocious losses in this very dry military historical style, and then go back into the closer perspective. And that, if you do that well, that's a kind of way of doing it. And people do, I think, forgive that a lot because you're telling a battle, and there's that kind of understanding.
So there's times where you can break the rules, and that's perfectly acceptable.
Yes, and battles traditionally are often done like that because it makes them so much enjoyable. It's that kind of, again, I think people fret a lot about, I'm using this particular point of view, so I shouldn't deviate from it. But kind of, a lot of people, including me, change tense quite a lot during battles. So I often switch into present tense, writing battle scenes, and kind of, I know other people do that, and it kind of, and again, it's just that immediacy, and that again, so you can have that contrast. I'll have that contrast between having a passage which has quite a kind of a past tense, quite kind of omnipotent narrator, dry kind of, and then they're kind of, the left wing charged, and kind of the enemy's right crumpled kind of language, and then you go into
someone on the left wing actually crumbling.
Yes, someone on the left wing crumbling. And it is that kind of gives you, I'm sure someone out there again will be like, oh look, it's kind of, but all the rest of the book is told in kind of third person, close past kind of, but she's breaking all the rules, well, she suddenly lost the ability to use her grammar. But most people will be like, yeah, I totally have this sense of different points of view, and this is making this battle alive for me. And again, this is what, coming back to everything I was saying last week, it's about making it come alive. And if you can make it come alive, then that everything else falls away. It's that kind of making things really come alive to it is kind of really.
That's great. That's what matters.
Yes. That's what
So
I
then closing out, what do you think about portraying the aftermath of battle? Like, what are some ways that writers can capture the toll of war and the real cost of suffering that has just occurred?
Oh, so yeah, I mean, I'm on it. I try and be honest about the way I imagine it, because kind of, I think it's important. I think that kind of, it really, the kind of writing a battle without having that sense of what the aftermath actually means, I think is just kind of, it isn't right, unless you're writing something really, really kind of cozy, in which case you possibly shouldn't. I don't know, maybe you shouldn't be writing a battle, to not be honest about.
At most, like I've seen like cozy with like a bar fight or like
Yes,
like
yes,
Yeah.
fisticuffs and
yes,
stuff like that.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. But that kind of, because that, to be honest, like, again, part of the reason we're currently in the horrible mess we're in is because we appear to be, a lot of us at the moment seem to be have countries run by people who have no ability to have no. There is that thing people point out after the Second World War. The people who've been through the Second World War were absolutely bloody determined to make sure that never happened again, because they knew what it meant.
We've lost the sense of what aftermath
we've lost
means.
that sense. We have now, so it's really noticeable in Britain when it comes round to Remembrance Sunday. We've gone from talking about remembering the horror of what people experienced to remembering our fallen heroes. And that shift in language is frightening. And I think if you're writing war and battles, you do have a responsibility not to sanitize it. And it's often, I mean, purely kind of from a very crude authorial perspective, it's often, and a reader perspective, it is often the aftermath that's the most interesting, because these are the people you care about. Yes, the Battle of Helm's Deep is wonderful, but if you didn't care about those people, if you didn't have any sense of the stakes of what would happen if the battle goes the wrong way, it wouldn't matter how beautifully that was filmed, because it would just be totally unimportant. It would just be it would be as rubbishy as a kind of rather sort of bad children's cartoon, because you wouldn't care. So to have the build up and then to have the aftermath of it, and that kind of, there has to be a cost and a consequence, and it is often the most kind of interesting and painful. The kind of the debt. I suppose the just little things like yes, the debt we were talking about earlier. The kind of you see your friend killed on the battlefield. I guess what's probably worse is finding them injured, alive, but they're not going to survive. That it's a different, then that gives you a whole different take on what's going to happen afterwards, or that kind of, and obviously, I mean, people talk about, this is kind of, again, where kind of things like realism in terms of the human body and medicine come in, because people often talk about things like, but half your characters should clearly be stumbling around, not able to do anything for the next kind of, I mean, we keep talking about kind of come back to the wargs and then Helm's Deep. There is no way that a doctor would simply say there is no way Aragorn should be able to fight in Helm's Deep, because by the time he's been eaten by a warg.
Bro, you fell into a fucking river. That alone.
He should, at the most, he should be able to kind of lie in a corner whimpering.
Yeah, but then no, he's just like, bro, I'm gonna just like open these doors. His doctor's like, you shouldn't even open those doors.
Go lay down.
Don't be Eowyn's wet dream. Go take a nap.
And there's that kind of point where obviously, if he came back from all of that looking completely well, there's that lovely scene where Legolas says, "You look terrible." If he came back looking, shiny and gorgeous, that would be at one level of absurdity. But when people say, "Oh, it's totally unrealistic," well, yeah, obviously it's unrealistic. It's a book. If this was real, they'd all be, if this was real, we'd have had sort of like 16 toilet breaks. The whole thing would not be, none of this.
We'd all be peasants and we'd be busy with the harvest.
Yeah.
We'd all be kind of like, sort of, we write out those bits, we write out the toilet breaks, we write out the blisters, we write out all of that stuff, because that would be really boring. Kind of 20 people, sort of take people say about, 24, that series that was done in real time. I mean, obviously it wasn't real time because he never stops to have a wee.
Yeah.
24 hours.
It's like
because
Jack
that would be
Bauer is
really stupid.
constipated.
Because that would, and similarly with, yes, there is a point, obviously, kind of, your characters are feeling beaten up. Some of them are injured, and some of them have got to be seriously injured, and maybe a couple of minor characters have got to die, because you can't have a massive, again, that kind of mysterious, gosh, isn't it incredible? After the entire battle, our group of 7 came out entirely unscathed. That's just not, now that just doesn't feel plausible. But to try and be really realistic, I mean, we do it all the time. There is no way armies are ever going to make the distances that we often have them travelling in fantasy. As soon as you start trying to write realistic fantasy, you're like, oh God, so I'm now going to write 6 months where we walk from point A to point
And
B.
how we have to like figure
Yes.
out like how all these soldiers get food
Yes,
and
yes.
Don't
supply
worry about the
chains.
water.
Yeah.
And the
Oh my
15
God.
horses every
Fantasy
single night.
readers, do
has
you want to
bring
hear
with
about
them.
supply chains? I don't
Yeah.
think you do.
Yes. And I mean, Christian Cameron actually does this really well. Again, Miles Cameron does this well at the beginning of The Red Knight, where The Red Knight, his first novel in the Bastard Son series, where he actually talks a bit about kind of, yes, technically we have a couple of 100 people in this military troop. And then he does actually talk about the fact that each one of those needs something like 6 horses, and each one of them also needs something like 3 grooms, and each groom also needs 4 horses. And it does get a bit like I Met a Man Going to St. Ives and the kind of sacks and cats and things. And it's just ridiculous. And he does talk about that, but he doesn't then let it kind of bother him.
It's there, but
Yeah.
then you don't
I mean,
it's kind of like
Yeah.
mentioning that
Yeah.
almost works in the context of being sort of like a satirical reflection on the reality of these things. It's like mentioning that and not having to like go into that, how that affects anything going farther. Just the sheer like absurdity of how much is required. knowing that is actually kind of like,
Yeah.
well, that's fucking insane.
Yes.
But then it doesn't have to bog down any other part of the story.
Yeah.
It almost
So
acts as like a very funny kind of satirical sort of commentary.
Yes, because I was actually having a conversation ended up reassuring someone about this at EasterCon, where we've been to what I did not feel was a terribly helpful talk where panel. We were talking about writing, fighting, where we were talking about the classic scene where someone sits at night staring into a watchfire. And of course, everyone points out, but you'd never do that because you're staring into the watchfire. You're basically going night blind. So the entire our barbarian horde could come up behind you, and you're not going to see them because you're night blind because you've been staring into a watchfire. But of course, if our young hero is sitting staring into the watchfire, and she's thinking about the boy she left behind, and she's thinking about her parents, and she's thinking about the future past, and she's thinking about the future, and she's remembering all these things, and you kind of feel it's possible, and then she's thinking about the fact she's on the eve of battle, and she might die, and she never told him she loved him, and she's probably not going to come back to him. And her father's died in the meantime, and all of this, and she's hoping, maybe she'll survive this, and then maybe she can go on and find some redemption, and blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter that she's gone night blind and that an entire barbarian horde could be sneaking up behind her, because the pathos of what's going on there on the eve of battle is far more important. And again, a week after someone's read that book, they might turn around and say, hang on a minute, that was really stupid. But at the time, they're just totally caught up in the kind of, oh my God, is she going to make it? Oh my God, I'm like sobs. She never told him she loved him. Like, oh God. And it doesn't matter because it is a known trope that works. And the reader kind of slips into it very easily, and it works beautifully. And it's those kind of levels of what is realistic, or the kind of,
it comes back to the humanity.
Yeah,
yes,
like rooting the realism,
yeah.
rooting the aftermath, the experience, kind of in the emotion and the psychology of it, as opposed to as much of like the minutia of, like how many fucking horses we need and whatever else, it's kind of like, because I think that's what's going to pull readers back in, is like the battle is going to work when there is an emotional investment in it. Denethor's reaction when Faramir is brought in half dead after he sent him out, that's the kind of thing that gets you. That's the kind of thing that like really digs into your core and makes you remember those scenes. And I think that's kind of like the best thing about battle scenes. And hopefully this is like a nice sort of endpoint for listeners and viewers, is like finding ways to make the
Connect with the
battle
emotion.
make the
Yes.
battle sort of enhance the emotional
Yeah.
and psychological state of your
And of
characters
course, when we're
and
writing
help
fantasy
readers connect
also,
better to that.
we are writing something which is slightly unreal. So that kind of, and again, the kind of, the kind of when Boromir takes all, the number of wounds Boromir takes in that kind of final scene when when the orcs are all taking, again, no one, clearly it is not pop, but that kind of the fact he is a strong and powerful man, he is somehow, he and Aragorn are somehow slightly out of the ordinary. They're not kind of weedy peasants. He is sort of almost superhuman. Again, Aragorn is clearly superhuman. And that kind of that tragedy of just how many wounds he's taking, and he's still going. Again, that terrible, wonderful image we have of, the guy is just going and going and going, and he's not, he's going to hold, and he's going to hold that bridge, and he's going to hold it, and he's going to let his companion, and he's taking so many wounds. And again, you'd be like, but that's not realistic. Well, this isn't realism. This isn't even within kind of, this is fantasy. Even within kind of the world of this, it's perfectly possible this person is taking all these wounds because they're a hero or they're a villain. They're a character in a fantasy novel. They are more than just human in some ways. They are fantastical. They are all kind of the opposite, the kind of the character who collapses from kind of one touch. Again, that's not realistic. The sort of, I have characters sort of talk about, characters with one sword stroke, he can kill 15 people. And again, obviously that's not realistic, but this is a fantasy novel. The power imbalances between the powerful figure with the sword and the 10 nothings that he kills. That's part of it. It's not just about, it's about humanity in the sense of bringing out that pathos, but it's not necessarily about realism in a kind of boring sense. It's about that kind of wonder and awe and kind of, it's almost a kind of metaphor. This person is taking more wounds than it is possible, not in a kind of ridiculous Black Knight, he's lost all his arms, his legs, and his sword in his teeth. But that kind of, that the number of wounds someone is taking is a kind of metaphor for their stand, their last stand against the dark or whatever. And so they can take that absurd number of wounds because they are that hero who is going beyond, and it is that moment. Again, one of those other moments we read fantasy for, that to transcend the kind of rather mundane reality, to be, that moment when one is the great hero and you are making that final stand against the dark and you are not going to let it defeat you. You are going to fight for what is good to your last moment, and you're going to take more wounds than is possible, because that is a metaphor for there is some good in the universe. There is some good in this world, and it is worth fighting for. So you can take your thousands of wounds because you're fighting for it, and that's one of the things that's at the core of fantasy. I think you can withstand a fireball, you can fight a dragon because you have to, because it's so important.
I couldn't think of a better way to end off this masterclass, Anna. Thank you so much. That was magnificent. And that's it for this writing masterclass, our two-parter with Anna. Thank you so much for fighting this battle alongside us. And to your point, fighting until the last stand.
Yes.
So we'll leave you with the imagery of like either Boromir in the forest or the dark, like the Black Knight in Monty Python and Quest for the Holy Grail. whichever one tickles your fighting fancy. But Anna, thank you again. This has been fantastic.
Thank you so
very much.
As well, if you contribute $5 or more to our Patreon, you can access an exclusive reading by Anna from her new novel, A Sword of Golden Ruin. So go check that out. Go check out the book. Go get Anderson versus Death if you're in for some grimdark cyberpunk. And Anna, where can folks find you online?
So folks can find me online at Facebook and Instagram as Anna Smith Spark. I also have a Facebook author page as Anna Smith Spark, which I don't update very often. So try and find me as a person, not necessarily as the author page. I'm on Blue Sky as Queen of Grimdark. I'm not on the bird thing, the evil bird thing. I am actually on TikTok, kind of, which I feel really ashamed about. My daughter ribs me about continually. So, I was like, okay, I post the occasional little video. I think I have something like 200 followers on TikTok. So
Hey, it's something.
Yeah, good start.
Got me. Yeah, and I have a website. quarterbrokenknives.net, which I really ought to change to a website with a shorter name at some point. Which has got some videos and some really gorgeous fan art and actually some recipes and a really cool film with some absolutely amazing music that a composer wrote for me, based on Empires of Dust, and which was incredible. And yes, and I'm doing a reading for the Patreon site for this, and I promise I will be doing it in a different room. You will not have any more shots.
There will be. I mean, it's audio only, but you can feel the curtain.
Oh, it's audio. That's right then. Right, no, that's fine. Then I can do it in front of this blind, and that's fine.
The curtain will actually work as soundproofing. It's totally fine.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. And you can also follow SFF Addicts across the board on any platform at SFF Addicts Pod. You can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. You can go check out my novel, Mushroom Blues. Greta, what about you?
Yeah, I'm on all the things at Greta K. Kelly. And go check out my brand new website, gretakkelly.com. And of course, you can get all of my books wherever you buy books.
And you can get MJ's books wherever you buy books as well. Support her cats. Support Greta's children. Support my children. Support Anna's children. Support
all the children.
Do it for the kids. Do it for the kids.
Yes.
And that's it for this week. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.